So that right there is 150 different islands. And so it will be to celebrate World Heritage, World Poetry Day, I should say. And it is a documentary that Dr. Rui Faria and his team put together based on an anthology that we published a few months ago called De Nem Sempre Saudade Chora. Saudade doesn't always weep. And saudade is our very Portuguese word for nostalgia. And so it will be with 10 young people reading poetry, 5 from the US, so they're all American born. It was their parents or their grandparents that immigrated, and they'll be reading in Portuguese, and 5 from the Azores, and then a few testimonials from 3 folks from the US and a couple from the Azores as well. So it'll be fascinating. It'll be at 1 o'clock. So the time is 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, 4 p.m. before Eastern Time, and I believe 3 hours less in Hawaii. So for our friends in Hawaii that want to join us, it will be at 10 a.m. Hawaiian time. And that will be followed by a presentation at 2 p.m. Of a called Into the Azorean Sea. And it will be with 6 Azorean American poets reading from their work and discussing their work. That one will be in English at 2 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, 5 p.m. for the East Coast, and 3 hours less, 11 o'clock in Hawaii. And so welcome each and every one of you. We're very excited about this presentation. And before Michael begins his presentation, talk a little bit about, I'll let Michael talk about himself because he can do a better job than I can. He is someone I've met through an event that was happened at Fresno State, a little course that was done about the Azores, and he's been a good friend for the last, I think, 3-4 months. We've communicated quite a bit, and we're excited about his work. But I'd like to introduce to you Tyler dos Santos Tam, and Tyler is the honorary consul of Portugal in Hawaii. He's also a friend as well, and a colleague, because I have the same kind of title, whatever that means is title, but the same for the San Joaquin Valley in California. There are a few of us in the West Coast, and Tyler is the honorary consul of Portugal in Hawaii. So it's an honor to have him here as well, and we'd like him to say a few words and welcoming everyone on behalf of Portugal as a representative of Portugal in Hawaii.
Well, thank you, Denise. And thank you to everyone tuning in for taking an interest in the Portuguese community in Hawaii. We are spread among 8 islands, so please add those to the list of the Mil Ilhas, in addition to the cities in California and everywhere else the Portuguese have gone throughout the world. You know, our community in Hawaii is one of just many of the diverse groups of people that came to the islands from all over the world, from China, from the Philippines, from Japan, from so many other shores. And just like every other shore that the Portuguese landed on, whether that was Brazil or Macau or Africa, or even in places in California, the Portuguese found ways to adapt to the local culture and maintain their traditions and weave them in really creative ways. So to this day in Hawaii, you can go to our favorite fast food restaurant, Zippy's, and you can get a Portuguese bean soup. You can go to bakeries throughout the islands and get a malasada or sweetbread. And there are so many other elements of Portuguese culture still alive. Later today, the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce of Hawaii is having a wine tasting. And that's because we obviously, that tradition has kept on going as well. Our love for wine and good food and fellowship. And of course, there's the ukulele, which came from a Portuguese instrument, which is now known worldwide. And that wouldn't have been possible without the Portuguese in Hawaii. So I want to turn it over to Michael now. You know, all of these things that I mentioned, this wonderful culture that we have in the islands with Portuguese elements could not have been possible without the first brave immigrants who sailed all around the world, literally around the world, and found their homes in the islands and found each other and found a community. And Michael's going to talk about that. So take it away, Michael.
You're on mute, Michael. Sorry.
That's okay. Me too.
Yeah.
Let me share screen real quick and
sure. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I will.
If you will,
I will.
Good.
I will. Let me just get this to the slideshow. So first, before I even talk about myself, I want to thank obviously the California State University of Fresno State, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute for including me in this wonderful event. And I want to also extend a big mahalo to Dinesh. It's interesting. We've known each other for 3 or 4 months now, and I already consider him a kindred spirit and maybe even a mentor of sorts. And I was thinking about this morning, and I thought, wow, that's so unique to meet someone so soon who has such an impact on you. But actually, after meeting others who know Dinesh, it seems like that's how he rolls. He's such an impactful and inspiring individual, and he's definitely been that to me. So thank you to Fresno State and the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, and thank you to Dinesh especially. It's kind of tradition in Hawaii, because of the complexity of our community and our cultures, to kind of be clear about your position. And so I'd like to do that now, if you'll allow me. I was born and raised on Oahu, grew up in a small community in Waianae, and attended a small Catholic school. The images we get of Hawaii look like this. That's the Waikiki shoreline, and of course that's the Nepali coast, Kalalau. But I grew up in a very, very tight, close-knit community in Waianae, in Plantation House. We used to call them Hicks houses because that was the company that built them. And my father moved out to the Leeward Coast when he was first married, because we could afford property there, and he raised his family there. He and my mother raised 5 kids. 3 of us were born from my parents, and 2, a tradition in Hawaii, were hanai. They were adopted from other family members and raised by my parents. My genealogy: this is my mom and dad. My dad is Joseph de Mattos. My mother is Maria Villa Freitas de Mattos. My father's father, my grandfather, is Antone. He was a feed developer, actually, for Metagold. Back then it was called Daramins. And my grandmother, this is a picture for her applying for a Hawaiian birth certificate. She was born by midwife. And interestingly, I found the transcripts to her petition for a birth certificate, and her primary task was to somehow prove that she was Portuguese and not Black. So again, the racialization process is active throughout the United States. We're active also in Hawaii, despite some of the unique and special and improved relationships we have in the islands compared to the rest of the continent. Some of those processes obviously were still in place. My grandmother on my mother's side was Matilda Freitas, and I don't know her husband. He died when my mother was very, very young, but her father was Joaquim Freitas, and he edited and produced a volume called Portuguese Hawaiian Memories. And so this is my family. And today I'm here in part honoring their legacy as Portuguese adventurers. My family first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands in 1881. The last member of my family arrived in 1899. So I'm 4th generation at this point. I should also beg forgiveness at this point. If you hear me mispronouncing words, because I realize I'm singing to the choir here, understand that my distance from the motherland, from both the Azores and Madeira, is 4 generations off. And I'm always admiring those who are still embedded in the language. So again, my forgiveness. And this is my immediate family. That's my wife and daughter. My wife is Francesca Benavides de Mattos. Her father is from the Azores, and her mother is Hawaiian Japanese. And this is my daughter. She's a graduate student in natural resources and environmental management. I'm a social worker by training. I am not a researcher per se, although I'm in the midst of some fairly heavy research. And I've spent 30 years of my life working primarily with families, and especially with runaway and homeless youth throughout the islands, but especially on this island. I've consider it my my fundamental task to help those who are struggling with mental health issues, with substance abuse issues, with socioeconomic issues, overcome some of the barriers they're facing and create opportunities for well-being and health. And so, but this project that I'll be presenting on today came about actually in class. I was teaching a class on interpersonal communication, and a student came up to me after the first day of class and said, "De Mattos, Italian?" And I looked at the student a little bit shocked, being fourth generation Portuguese in the islands. And I said, "Are you from here?" And the student said, yes, she was. And I was surprised because the Portuguese presence in the islands is incredibly strong. And while we do have many Italian, those of Italian descent, the Italian legacy is actually relatively small. The Portuguese, along with Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and Korean, are part of a plantation legacy and history here. And it dawned on me that it was important for me first to get in touch with my own history and legacy and my Portuguese identity, but also to do some research because I was concerned that there may be a loss of Portuguese-ness and recognition as such in the broader community. And so I went down the rabbit hole. Today, I'd like to present specifically on March 25th, 1896. In that year, Portuguese united and marched on the newly formed Republic of Hawaii. So I'll give a brief history lesson in a moment, but that singular event was critical, not the only one, but one of the critical points, nexus in Portuguese identity formation in Hawaii. Remember that the Portuguese arrived in the islands in 1878 in mass. It's been documented there's well over 400 Portuguese in the islands before mass migration, but really in 1878, the first shipment of Portuguese from Madeira aboard the ship, the Priscilla, arrived in Hawaii and began a long 20 plus year immigration process to the islands. But in 1896, close to 20 years after first arrival, the Portuguese, based on several concerns they had, decided that their only recourse was to march on the President Dole, who was a significant figure in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, and march on the Republic of Hawaii with a Portuguese petition and list of demands. Actually more a list of concerns rather than demands, but also some possible solutions. And so I'm understanding, as I've done this research, I'm recognizing that this was one of the critical moments of Portuguese identity formation in Hawaii, and I'd like to share that research with you today. So let me give you, and this is like a really brief history, because that's not what this presentation is about, but I do need to provide a context. So first, the Hawaiian Islands were settled as early as 400 AD. It used to be that we thought that it was likely somewhere around 1200, but more recent information leads us to believe that it was before that. And we also are aware that there were two waves. The first likely from the Marquesas and the second likely from Tahiti. But clearly, I share this with you so that we recognize that European discovery, and I'll put that in quotes, occurred long after Polynesian navigation sailed across the Pacific and settled in the Hawaiian Islands. The kingdom was unified under Kamehameha the Great in 1795. He unified all of the islands by force, except Kauai, which was pulled into the fold, and the islands were united in 1795. Missionaries first began arriving in the 1820s. There was already European knowledge and awareness. Obviously, Cook had arrived much earlier, but really the significant cultural changes that occurred as a result of missionaries arriving in the 1820s were far-reaching and would forever change the Hawaiian Islands as we know it and the history of Hawaii as we know it. So along with the missionaries and other Europeans came diseases, and the native Hawaiian population was decimated. Some estimates, I know David Stannard I think conservative estimates have the population of Hawaii upon European contact somewhere around 300 or 400,000. David Stannard, in his book Before the Horror, has a much larger estimate, somewhere near 800,000. So the islands were able to support a fairly large population. But the Hawaiian population in particular, Kanaka Maoli, were decimated because of disease. And we saw that by the time the Portuguese arrived in 1878, they were a fraction of the total population that Europeans first met upon contact. European and American settlers developed a sugar industry early in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Interestingly, there's strong reason to believe that the first successful growth of sugarcane in the islands was in Maui by a Portuguese person. Obviously, the Azores and both the Azores and Madeira have histories of sugarcane growing, and they have strong agricultural histories, and so they brought that with them. With the native Hawaiian population decimated, there was a need for labor. And the voracious appetite of capitalism will pursue the cheapest labor it can find across the globe. And laborers were imported from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines a little bit later. The waves were sporadic and successive. So we had early Chinese immigrants. And you'll notice that I don't have the Portuguese in there yet, and I'll explain that in a second. But you had Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Filipino in succession, but they weren't singular migration processes. Sometimes there were Japanese immigration that occurred, and then a delay, and then reinstituted. In 1878, again, immigration primarily from the Azores and Madeira began. In fact, the first was aboard the Priscilla. The first immigrants from Madeira came aboard the Priscilla and arrived in 1878. And for the next, there were two waves, 1878 to 1888 roughly, and then it was reinstituted later on, and we had another large wave. In 1887, David Kalakaua, who was reigning at the time, was forced to change the Constitution, and the Bayonet Constitution famously was established that basically stripped the monarchy of much of its powers. It's called the Bayonet Constitution because it was under force. And if he did not change the Constitution and adopt the new Constitution formed by the American League and the Honolulu Rifles, there was a threat of overthrow, which, as it turns out, happened in 1893. The Queen, Liliuokalani, was in the process of deposing the Bayonet Constitution and reinstituting a new constitution that would reestablish monarchical power, and European and American forces overthrew her as a result, so that would not happen. In 1894, the Republic of Hawaii formed after the early attempts at annexation failed, and the first president was Sanford B. Dole. He and Lauren Thurston were prime movers of the overthrow and took positions in the political system once the overthrow had occurred. So again, this isn't about the overthrow, and it isn't about this history, but it's important to understand this context, because it's within this context that the Portuguese March occurred in 1896. So let's talk about the March on the Republic. It was March 25th, 1896. I realize that there may be some amongst us who are unaware of the geography of Honolulu, but I'll share this with you. The Portuguese marched on President Dole in the Republic of Hawaii on this morning. It was allegedly 600 to 1,000 strong, and that's as advertised and reported on in the English language newspapers. I'll call that the English press. The Portuguese press, particularly Oluso, reported that there were 2,000 Europeans present and 1,200 Portuguese present in the march. It's clear that there is a rationale for both parties, the English press and the Portuguese press, to report the numbers as they did. One report in the English press had the total number of Portuguese on the march at somewhere around 600, and they described it as orderly, civil, and close to a funeral procession in its civility. That were you not to know it, the silence of the march would be deafening. But they also reported that there were onlookers, and the onlookers were from every segment of society, primarily the European segment, which is suspect because the European portion of the population that was non-Portuguese was incredibly small. You're looking at 3 to 5% of the total population. For there to be 800 Europeans there, admittedly it's downtown, so you'd have a concentration, still is unlikely. But there was reporting in the newspaper that one report had the onlookers as being fairly respectful, but other reports had them teasing and gawking and pointing fingers at the Portuguese procession. Again, Oluso reports that there were 2,000 Europeans, 1,200 Portuguese marched. They marched from the foothills of Punch Bowl. Punch Bowl had been likened to a little Madeira. It's on the slopes of a dormant volcano, and it was clearly a Portuguese enclave. They marched from Punch Bowl from their own hall, Lusitana Hall, marched down through downtown Honolulu and to the executive building. Interesting, the executive building was an occupied space. It was Iolani Palace before the overthrow. The only palace, by the way, monarchical palace in the United States, but it became the executive building. That's probably about a mile or so march, maybe a mile or two, depending on the specific route they took. The streets, again, I mentioned this, were lined with gawkers, some of whom heckled the Portuguese. A central committee made up of 20 or so distinguished Portuguese from the community, the Central Committee of the União Portuguesa, presented the petition detailing concerns of the colony. I will say that the presentation of the petition was a controversy in itself. And the primary controversy was identified by the English language press, by the English language newspapers. And they basically said, look, parliamentary procedure is such that the Portuguese should have found a representative from the Republic to present their petition to the legislature and to the president so as not to make a scene. What's interesting was that there was incredible civility amongst this, and it should be noted that one of the leaders of the Central Committee, in fact, had trained as a lawyer under Sanford B. Dole, who was then president. So we can surmise that the nature of the relationship between Portuguese leadership and the legislature and presidency of the Republic were probably not quite strained, and that this was, in all likelihood, a demonstration of spectacle so that the Portuguese could show unification and solidarity, but that they would indeed present their petition in a civil way that was respectful of the government in place at time. But the newspapers did have a little bit of a field day with this, in that their big concern was, you had let's say 10,000 Portuguese living in the islands, distributed amongst the islands. In 1896, there were 25,000 Japanese, 21,000 Chinese living in the islands. And the paper was very clear. If you're going to allow the Portuguese to march on the president and the Republic, what will happen when the Japanese or Chinese choose to march? Will it resemble more of a riot than a civil march? And so the Portuguese, in some ways, accomplished perhaps what they wanted to. It went unstated, but the spectacle was an important aspect of this march, and it should be recognized as such. These were, by the way, taken from the Library of Congress, Chronicling America, the historic American newspaper site. In the press, it got excellent coverage. In fact, near daily coverage, and in some days on some days, multiple articles written about the Portuguese, interviewing a significant Portuguese in the community. And they detailed the Portuguese petition in a granular way. In fact, they presented the entire petition in the newspaper. And the concerns the Portuguese raised were predictable. One was an incredibly high cost of living. Not only was there a high cost of living, but the sugar planters on the plantations, for those Portuguese who were still working on the plantation, ran company stores. And so it concentrated wealth in the sugar planters' hands, because plantation workers and laborers had limited access to alternative resources and bought most of their needed sundries from the plantation themselves, and those prices were problematic. And so the high cost of living was present, but it was also present in the city center, in the metropole. And so this high cost of living with stagnant wages became problematic and represented, in effect, a decrease in wages over time. So again, low wages, but these were low wages both on and off the plantation. So we know that there was a hierarchy of wages on the plantation, with the white economic elite in Hawaii, often referred to and referred to in modern histories, including the work of Takaki, Bastos, and Sasaki and others, referred to as haole, the haole economic elite. And the sugar planters and the government representatives, in some people's estimation, were one and the same, or at the very least, very closely related. And so the wages in Honolulu were incredibly low, especially in light of the cost of living, because importation of goods to Hawaii were incredibly expensive. There was also concerns about an inequitable tax system. And in fact, the Republic of Hawaii admitted as much. The Portuguese correctly identified that the poor and middle class paid a disproportionately high rate of taxes, while those who were identified as large land owners, also known as the sugar planters, the plantation owners, paid incredibly low taxes. And they saw this as clearly unjust, that if in fact the sugar planters were taxed equitably, that resources could be more evenly distributed and the cost of living could be improved. But as long as wealth was being concentrated in the hands of a few, that cost of living was going to remain high because it benefited those few. And I should say, by the way, that the petition was incredibly well written, succinct and clear. In fact, Dinesh helped me with that when he was able to translate this from the Portuguese to English for me in some of the pieces. And while many of the Portuguese from the Azores and Madeira arrived as illiterate, that is not the same as being unintelligent. This was an incredibly smart population that had recognized what happens in a socio-political and economic system where wealth was concentrated, as it was both in the Azores and in Madeira. So this was a population that was particularly sensitive to those inequities, and they correctly identified those. And in fact, that was supported by the Republic. They admitted as much. Their final concern was, in their mind, a causal factor, that the unmitigated importation of Asian labor was driving down wages, driving up the cost of living. And because there was a flood of laborers, it meant that the Portuguese in particular felt like they became barriers to opportunities. And it is a bit complicated. In the petition, they talk about Asiatic labor, but in interviews, they talk in particular about Japanese labor importation, because that was the latest wave. In many ways, the sugar planters imported labor diversely. And that was a clear strategy to prevent organizing and unionizing. And that has been clearly stated in the history books and clearly stated even in the press at the time. You could find newspaper articles where they openly talk about that. So it was already a form of labor busting and union busting or preventing organization. And so these waves of labor came in particular orders. There was some shifting in that, but we saw the first wave of labor as Chinese labor. The second wave was Portuguese labor, in many ways in response to Chinese labor, and then Japanese labor, Korean labor, and Filipino labor, etc. But there were other factors too. So there was a fomentation of Portuguese organization that you could find in the press. By the way, I have little references here. The 6 and 16 you see at the end of the slideshow. I've got some references that you can turn to give you more information on this. The first was concerns over living conditions. Again, because of the cost of living, living conditions could be poor. Although the English press and the Portuguese press noted that the Portuguese in Hawaii developed beautiful properties. They were gardeners and farmers, oftentimes by trade, or at least have long histories of that. And so their properties were well maintained and well held. There was also, this was a time of tumultuous socio-political conditions. As I just shared, there was a vying for power, and by 1896, the bayonet the Mehele had occurred, where land was privatized. You had the bayonet constitution, which represented a forced constitution impressed on the monarchy. You had the overthrow of the queen, and in fact, she was tried. I think it was in early 1896 or maybe in late 1895, but found guilty in 1896. And amidst all this tumult, the Portuguese were trying to eke out a living, and they were trying to figure out their place. There was also concern over their poor treatment and low appreciation. The Portuguese were at times exploited. They were a European settler community. Unlike the other groups that came as laborers, the Portuguese were recruited as settlers, and that means that they brought their families. In fact, one of the reasons why the first wave of Portuguese recruitment came to a close is because of the expense. The Portuguese brought their children, they brought their grandparents or the laborers' parents, and so the expense on the government and the expense for the sugar planters was high. But they were brought expressly as a European settler community. There was, again, the exploitation. The Portuguese actually talk about this in the English language press, where they were asked / voluntarily / coerced to join things like the American League. They talked about how once the Republic was established, that the Portuguese were essentially forgotten, that despite being recruited as settlers, they were treated as disposable laborers. And really, the Portuguese March, and this should be the subtitle of this presentation, this was a march for whiteness in many ways, because the Portuguese were conflated with labor, but actually nobody. I think there are several people, including Sasaki and Jung and others, who talked about how the Portuguese were recognized as Portuguese. They saw themselves, by the way, as Azorean and Madeiran. In 1896, we didn't have many Portuguese from the continent. Most were from the islands, from insular Portugal. But they were never fully accepted as white settlers, as white European settlers. They were more often identified as part of a laboring plantation society, and in fact are part of the local community. When you go to when people who in the islands identify as local, oftentimes they clearly link their histories to the Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino ancestors who came here to work the plantations. The Portuguese were clearly laborers. I should say at this point too that the Portuguese have been linked to middle management, to the Luna, as we say in Hawaii, But as Moon Ki Young acknowledges, most Luna weren't Portuguese and most Portuguese weren't Luna, but they are conflated and associated with that middle management position. The other thing that the Portuguese sometimes get identified as were as buffers between Asian labor and the white economic elite, the sugar planters. And so that's been identified again by numerous historians as definitely not my, that's not something I'm claiming, but they saw themselves as different and unique, and perhaps not wholly not part of the economic elite, but also hesitant and reticent to be associated or conflated with Asian labor. And then finally, on an international note, there was Portuguese victory in Mozambique, as Newitt identifies in his work, that that Mozambique was interesting because as the Portuguese secured Mozambique, they were recruiting from across the Portuguese colonies globally, and they were looking for settlers. And in fact, they were looking for settlers in a very similar pattern that they looked for in other Portuguese settlements. They were looking for entire families. Their concern was that if they sent Portuguese men as laborers to settle, that in fact it wouldn't be a Portuguese colony or settlement, because they'd integrate and adapt, as Tyler talked about earlier, to the local community, and the Portuguese holding would fail. As it turns out, the victory in Mozambique did a couple things. One is it stimulated a sense of patriotism here in the islands, but it also provided leverage. As we'll see in a second, it was one of the things that you could see in the press, that there was a threat preceding the Portuguese petition that the Portuguese colony, or a significant number of the colony, may move to Africa. And as Newitt suggests or states, that was never likely to happen, not from Hawaii, but also not from many other places around the globe. So the Portuguese in the press, here's the posting from the Library of Congress. There may be an exodus, Portuguese planning to leave the islands, was the headline. 3,000 to 5,000, their dissatisfaction, home government aid. So the government did in fact promise acreage, promised produce and products and animals, farm animals, if people were willing to move. Then, of course, the Portuguese organizing, enthusiastic meeting held last night. Actually, that meeting was enthusiastic. They were expecting 25 people to show up, and actually upwards of 300 showed up. So that was a momentous moment. This is interesting. So when the English language press got wind of the Portuguese organizing, the assumption was that Portuguese were out of work. As it turns out, they weren't out of work. So what the sugar planters did was they made a specific request in the newspaper for laborers. They wanted 300 able-bodied Portuguese laborers to work on the sugar plantation. This ruse was designed to thwart the march on the Republic before it ever started. The Portuguese actually sniffed this out, as you would imagine a good laboring force would, and identified it as such in the press. So whenever the English press interviewed someone, sometimes they'd name the person, but more often or not, they'd say a dignified or a notable Portuguese from the community has stated. And basically what happened in the press is the Portuguese representative said, we know what the sugar planters are doing, but this has nothing to do with whether we're unemployed. We're arguing that we're underemployed, that in fact, our earnings based on the cost of living are not sustainable. And so literally no one applied. Not one application came in, and that made the press too. When the Portuguese marched, it was a big demonstration. Portuguese club waits on government, the headline reads. But later that same day, small showing made by the Portuguese. Again, there were concerns that if the Portuguese organized, that you could have other race class groups organizing, including some of the Asian labor, and that was the big fear at the time. So I thought you'd get a kick out of that. And so basically what happened is President Dole submitted the petition to the legislature. The legislature held a joint committee between the Senate and the House, and they evaluated the Portuguese petition. And in the interim between the submission to the legislature and the legislature sharing their findings, the Portuguese were both built up and torn down in the press. So the Portuguese plans, the União Portuguesa was the Portuguese Union. They proposed to abolish contract labor on the plantations and raise all the canes themselves. In fact, the Portuguese did suggest that contract labor would eventually fail, that if you could get homesteading and other forms, that the Portuguese effort and other efforts would increase as a portion of the profits found their way into Portuguese pockets and not solely into the sugar planters. As you might imagine, a plan like that was not held in high esteem by the sugar planters, who are concentrating the wealth in their own pockets. Also at this time, Consul General Shimamura was interviewed, and they positioned, the English language press positioned the Japanese versus the Portuguese, which again is a racial strategy that we find throughout the United States and in its holdings, to pit one ethnic group or racial group against another. Basically, the Consul General Shimamura said, the Portuguese can march all they want. In the end, sugar is king, and that will be proven out no matter what anyone does. And the sugar planters will pursue the labor that's the most economical. And in fact, General Shimamura was correct, as we'll learn in a minute. Also, there was a supposed riot on the foothills of Punch Bowl. Actually, what had happened is a retired police officer punched a Portuguese child, and the Portuguese in the neighborhood, it was Trix Nelson, witnessing the assault, attacked the ex-police officer. The police officer was shuttled away to another police officer's home, and the Portuguese who retaliated were arrested. This became famously known as the Punch Bowl riots. In fact, Sanford B. Dole came out of his executive building to help quell the participants in the riot. As it came out, it was determined that in fact the Portuguese did not initiate the event, but did settle the event by pulling fence posts pickets off of fences to protect themselves, and also to fend off the police that were trying to arrest them. And so, interestingly, between the time of submission to the legislature, the petition submission to the legislature, and the time of return of the legislature's verdict or determination, the Portuguese remained in the press beyond what they normally were. So the Portuguese were regularly in the press for other things, including converting to the Protestant faith, that was recorded, and taking pledges of allegiance to the new republic, that was recorded, and of course births and deaths, as well as schools and education and those types of things. But in this interim, the Portuguese were regularly in the press, and at times being celebrated as worthy and amazing citizens of the Republic, and at other times bordering on barbaric. And it should be stated, by the way, that Sanford B. Dole, the president, earlier on is on record calling the Portuguese the barbaric others, while Lauren Thurston thought that the Portuguese were ideal settlers and would help the American government as they'd see the Portuguese presence as attractive to annexation. So again, the utilization of the Portuguese, and by the way, the utilization of every group that was imported to work the plantations in one way or another. So I'm in no way trying to minimize the ordeals of other groups, because as immigration goes, we know that the ordeals are often shared amongst groups. So again, from the Library of Congress. So what was the legislative response? Actually, it was probably what most of you are thinking. Relative to the cost of living and wages, the committee said that your committee does not find that since the arrival of the various shipments of Portuguese laborers, wages for Portuguese laborers on plantations have been reduced by the immigration of Chinese and Japanese laborers, or from any case, such wages at the present time being about the same as they were when the Portuguese laborers came into the country. So basically they said, yeah, the wages are stable. Actually, that's not exactly true, because this was in 1896 and the Portuguese first arrived in 1878. That's almost a 20-year window. When we look at that, wages being relatively stable for 20 years, in effect, creates a condition of suppressed wages because the cost of living goes up. And if the wages remain stable, then the purchasing power is actually diminished. So again, I guess that's what I stated there. In the Portuguese press, the Portuguese estimated that wage suppression represented a 20% decrease in actual capacity of purchasing power. So even though the wages had remained stable, it represented a significant decrease in wages because of the cost of living. Let me just back up there. The other thing that the legislature found was that the Portuguese shouldn't be complaining because the Japanese were doing to them what the Portuguese did to the Chinese, as if that were a reasonable excuse. Actually, it shouldn't have happened when the Portuguese arrived, and it shouldn't have happened when the Japanese arrived. That in fact, you had to create conditions of equity, but it was in the sugar planters' best interest to not have that. And in fact, there were wage gradients depending on the groups. As for taxes, they said the actual increase of taxation has undoubtedly happened in many instances through the actual increase of the value of real estate. So property values were going up. And while it is true that small property holders in some cases pay taxes upon a higher proportional assessment than is the case with large property holders, there has been no increase in the statutory rate of taxation on real and personal properties since the year. Actually, what was interesting was in the press, as the Portuguese complained of high taxes, they also, their complaint was about taxes, but more than that, their complaint was about inequity. And it was the inequity that just grated their last nerve, as my mom used to say, irritated that last nerve, because they saw large landowners, AKA sugar planters, paying incredibly small taxes on incredibly large tracts of land that, were they taxed equitably, could fundamentally change the life of the poor and the middle class in the islands. Also in the press, the Portuguese were blamed for their taxation rates. And this was really funny. Talk about blaming the victim. They basically said that the Portuguese had improved their properties to the point that the property value went up and thus could be taxed at a higher rate. Their recommendation: the Portuguese move out of Honolulu, back to the countryside, return to work on the plantation, because the Portuguese, like almost every group that was here, upon completion of their contract, there's a contract labor system, indentured labor, that upon completion of their contract, many Portuguese left the plantations. Many stayed, but many left. Similarly to other groups, the recommendation of the legislature and the recommendation of the white economic elite was to go back to the countryside, go back to the plantation, and in fact, the government would provide property to do so. And surely some Portuguese took advantage of that, but many, and in fact, in their response, the Portuguese said, we have no intention of returning to the plantations, and we have no intention of moving to the countryside. So those who had moved to the cities, including Hilo, Honolulu, Wailuku, etc., there was no intention of moving back. And so in the Portuguese estimation, the Republic had missed the boat on that one. They had missed the point of the entire complaint. As for Asian labor, I shared this already in regards to the introduction of Chinese Japanese. We feel that the numbers admitted must be strictly limited to the necessary needs of the industrial enterprises of the country, but to prejudice these enterprises by shutting off their supply of necessary labor entirely will entail misfortune upon the whole country and upon all wage earners. Again, this is actually a pretty powerful statement when you think about this, especially when you think that the government and the sugar planters, in some estimation, were one and the same. So the Republic actually, Asian labor and Asian citizens of the United States, with the overthrow of the monarchy, and even before that with the Bayonet Constitution, Asians in the islands who had rights, including the right to vote, became disenfranchised with both the bayonet constitution and with the overthrow of the monarchy. So folks who once had rights had those rights removed. And so the reality is that the Japanese, Chinese, Korean, etc., Filipino, etc., had suffered immensely through this transition, including many of their civil rights. It was fascinating to see how the government distanced themselves from industry. And basically, there was this anti-Asian sentiment in the islands amongst the white economic elite, but there was no way they were going to sacrifice the opportunity for Asian labor, the ongoing influx of Asian labor, because they were needed. They argued that the Portuguese did to the Chinese, that Japanese were doing to the Portuguese what the Chinese did, Portuguese did to the Chinese, and the sugar planters ironically, and Sasaki mentions this, the irony is that the sugar planter practice of docking pay for supplies for living contributed to a permanent Japanese population. And so the irony was that the sugar planters' own practices, in fact, created conditions so that the Japanese, instead of returning home, stayed. That was at least a partial explanation. There are numerous others. So this is actually where I get to thank Dinesh here, because he is central to my research. There were 12 newspapers, Portuguese newspapers in Hawaii at one point, or over the span of Portuguese presence here, 8 on Oahu, 4 on the neighbor islands. At the time, in 1896, there was one newspaper, and it was a combination of União Lusitana and a Sentinela. Both were alive and well in 1895. Both got shuttered, and they unified and became Oluso. And we found several articles that talked about the march, talked about the organization, and including the Constitution, including its 15 articles, and the Portuguese response to the legislative response. And here's some of the things that we found. One was that they were clear, and by the way, what I'll share is these first 2 sections are really about the solidarity of the Portuguese people. In my research on Portuguese from the Azores and from Madeira, it's clear, and in talking to Dinesh, quite frankly, and others, it's clear that Portuguese from insular Portugal, from the Atlantic islands, often saw their identities in very particular ways, including identity to family, to village, to island, to archipelago, and then perhaps to motherland. What the União Portuguesa was demanding in many ways was that those other identities, at least here in Hawaii, be subjugated, not erased, but subjugated for a Portuguese identity. That Portuguese identity was critical to coordinating, to solidifying, and to unifying. And so they said this is a statement on the solidarity, is Article 1, actually, of the Constitution of the União. The Portuguese colony of Honolulu, convinced that the vast majority of our compatriots in Hawaii haven't been, up to now, heard in their just grievances that the Asian invasion, strong language, has been threatening the future of the colony, and that the government hasn't taken the necessary measures to prevent such a crisis, therefore resolved that it was necessary to come together politically, independent of creed, in order to protect itself in the Hawaiian Islands against the negligence of the government in recognizing and act upon our just grievances. Dinesh and I kind of talked about this notion of creed, because I think the initial reading of creed leads you naturally to religion. But this was a political group. This was not a benevolent society. This was not a charitable organization. This was not a religious organization. This was a political organization, as stated in their first article. In this sense, I think it's healthier and more intuitive to think about creed as beliefs, values, and faith. And in this sense, it's not just religion. In fact, it's not at all. This is really about loyalists and royalists. It's about a political organizing and a recognition that we need to be aware that there are some Portuguese in the Union, in the colony, that supported the monarchy, and there are those who supported the republic. There are some historians that argue that the Portuguese, in fact, supported, in total, supported the republic. But actually, in 1894, there was the newspapers the English language newspapers identified two Portuguese newspapers at the time. One they described as a pro-annexationist rag, and the other was a pro-monarchy rag. And so these newspapers were clearly organized and structured around the interests of their constituency. We should, by the way, expect that level of complexity amongst groups of people, that there, if anything, if we've learned anything in studying our histories, is that there is as much complexity within a group as there is between groups. And it's really important to recognize that. The other thing that they wanted to be clear about, and this was one of the ways they unified, is a love of the homeland, not forgetting the obligation that through all methods at its disposal, we will cultivate and maintain the Portuguese, the love of the homeland, and to stimulate the union between all its members, encouraging all continued labor and the education of their children. The Portuguese Union expects unanimous cooperation in order to achieve all of its objectives that entail the advancement and the elevation of the Lusitanian colony in Hawaii. I should make clear that education was not a top priority as reflected in persistence in school. Portuguese children were known to leave school early to become wage earners and to participate in the purchase of land. The Portuguese, maybe more than any other group, saw land as the avenue to the middle class, while others saw education as the avenue to the middle class. But if we understand the limitations that those from the Azores and Madeira experience, it's not hard to see why land would be so central in their thinking. So this was a political interest group, not a club, not a religious organization, not a benevolent society. And they were asking for unification. And I was thinking about this, and Dinesh, I'd love to hear your feedback on this because you and I have read through this material. But they were asking for solidarity across the Pacific archipelago, across our islands, because we have our 8 islands, the Azores have their 9, and Madeira, of course, has its archipelago. But they were also asking for the Portuguese to unify, of course, across the Atlantic archipelagos. Again, if we understand Azorean and Madeiran tendencies to identify with family, village, island, and archipelago, and then motherland, really what the União was trying to say is we must first and foremost be Portuguese. If we're not first and foremost Portuguese, then organizing will be close to impossible and we won't get our interests met. So that's, I think that was probably an hour. I think spot on. These I've included readings, and this is just a short list of readings, but there are many, many, many others. And Dinesh, and others, I'd like to open it for questions.
Sure. Yes, indeed. It was, first of all, it was fascinating as always. You're a pleasure to listen to. And indeed, I think that it was a call for unity. And that's the reason that they identified always, because in other aspects of the newspaper that we looked at, they talked about the Azores, they talked about Madeira, they talked about Porto Santo, etc. But this called for a unifying of all the Portuguese, independently if you were from São Miguel or Madeira, if you were from Porto Santo or Pico, they wanted you to identify as Portuguese, to have a little bit more power in numbers, and to have at the time the Azores and Madeira were not autonomous regions, and so they were just they were just archipelagos forgotten by Portugal. And so there wasn't I don't even think there was sort of as you mentioned, there wasn't even a strong Azorean or Madeiran identity per se. I mean, there's always been, but it wasn't something that was talked about, because you were a Portuguese from São Miguel, or you were a Portuguese from Madeira, or you were Portuguese from Terceira, or a Portuguese from São Jorge. So that process came a little bit later. Rui Faria, who was the president of the Azores Immigrant Association, says in the Azores, the newspapers draw a lot of cartoons about the bad things happening to the Portuguese in Hawaii. Did this happen in the Hawaiian press?
It did. There were cartoons about the Portuguese, and there were cartoons about every minority group imported to work the plantations. And there were So the contract labor system in Hawaii by Coleman in 1903 was likened to slave-like conditions. Now, she didn't go so far as, and I don't even want to go close to that, in the sense that I recognize the tragedy of slavery across the southern United States and across the United States in general. But this was definitely, we're talking indentured workers that were objectified and dehumanized in a way that made the push of labor possible. For many who are aware of the sugar industry, it's recognized as an industry that can only thrive with a dirt wages or slave-like labor. It's a very, very hard agricultural endeavor that to turn a profit requires very particular ways. And so the cartoons that we saw about the various groups all contributed to a dehumanization and objectification that made pushing them like mules in the plantations easier. And it should be noted that oftentimes the Luna, and there were Hawaiian Luna, Japanese Luna, Portuguese Luna, there were Luna of every race, although the Portuguese are more commonly conflated with that was also a common practice, to use the people who were working the fields to drive the laborers. So that was a strategy.
Good question, and thank you, Hui, for participating. I wanted to kind of transition about 100 years now, or a little over, and Tyler's still joining us, so he can, of course, comment as well. And again, first and foremost, Michael, thank you so much. I think it was fascinating. I think for those who know Hawaiian history, maybe it wasn't, but I think it gave you a lot of different things that, I mean, it's amazing to see and I think even if you are from Hawaii, you've learned at least 3 or 4 things in this presentation. So I thank you very, very much. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to ask the question from Hui in a little bit, but before that, let's transition a little bit to now. And as you mentioned, most are either in your case, you're just about 100% Azorean or Madeiran, but lots of folks are a mixture, of Portuguese, Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, everything that's all the different groups that came as laborers to Hawaii, and of course, native population as well. And so if we look at now, I think Tyler's probably about the same, 4th generation, 3rd, 4th generation. Yeah, 5th generations. We have, I'm sure, lots of 5th generation already also in Hawaii. And Tyler mentioned that in the outset of it, that you can go to your favorites, what we call here In-N-Out Burger. That's our favorite here. You can go to your favorite fast food place, and get Portuguese food, the malasadas, which I thought was excellent when I went to Hawaii a couple of times already. And it was just, it was sometimes even more emotional than tasting the malasadas. It was just, from someone who lives in California all of his life, and you can't find anyone carrying filhos, and you can go to, some people call filhos, some people call malasadas. And then you go to Hawaii and you see them in every single corner, with every coffee shop, and every place has them. It was an emotional feeling as well. However, what are some of the challenges? How do we, all of us, and you who live and of course in the islands, how do we promote Portuguese, and in a particular case Azoreanness and Madeiraness, because most of the Portuguese, as you mentioned, have ties, whether it be 3rd, 4th, or 5th generation, to those 2 archipelagos, because that was the biggest majority of laborers brought to Hawaii. So how do you keep the language just pretty much died, let's put it that way, I think. Okay, so how do you keep the culture alive? And food, of course, is very important, but because you can get other people and other cultures to like food. I like Mexican food, and I'm not Mexican, but it's one of my favorite foods that I like. And so how do we keep some of the Azoreanness alive and the Madeiraness alive? How do we keep this insular Portugal alive in another archipelago that is literally in the other end of the world, just about, opposite ends almost? And And how do you keep the younger generation? I mean, Tyler's probably an example, but not everyone is like Tyler. How do you keep the younger generation? How do you bring the younger generation in? Um, and what can we do inter-community? What can we do between, we're not that far, California to Hawaii and the West Coast and even the East Coast and Canada. How can we all connect a little bit better? And what do you see for the near future to bring more awareness and for younger Hawaiians who are of Portuguese ancestry? Anybody want to take that one on? Don't get all excited and trip over each other.
I can
But
say
anyway,
one thing.
sure.
I can say one thing for sure. I I think it's important to recognize that when we learn a more complete history, we identify. And so a history like this, and I think one that appreciates the complexities and the nuances, that there isn't a pat answer for how any group assimilated, adapted, or frankly resisted. And all of those have value, and learning those histories, it reinscribes identity in a lot of ways. In meeting with you, Dinesh, and talking with Tyler and doing this research, as frankly as a social worker who was never a historian, I felt more connected to my history, to my father, to my grandfather. And I think back to that student who said, D'Amato's Italian, right? That I want to encourage her to understand her history and her legacy and how she got here as someone who was born here. And that as we appreciate that, I think we can re-embrace our legacies. And so I think that's a small part of it, but it is one part of it, because this moment, the one that I described, for the Portuguese who were living at that time, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. In the history books, it doesn't show up, and it might not be a big deal, but for them it was. And so learning that and hearing that, I think, becomes validating of your own identity and your own sense of culture.
And Denise, to your question, I think that this is an issue not just in Hawaii, but all across the United States. That, we get to the third and fourth and fifth generation.
Yeah.
I think in Hawaii, it's particularly a challenge. As we mentioned, there's a lot of mixtures between cultures, and along the way, other cultures maybe get a little bit more highlighted. One thing that Michael didn't quite get to, but is an essential theme, I think, with the Portuguese in Hawaii, is there was sort of a sense of shame, I think, of also being Portuguese. And the Portuguese were often the subject of ridicule. We have Portuguese jokes here, some of which are very lighthearted and funny, and some are a little bit more mean. And I think that's due to sort of the interesting position that the Portuguese had in the plantation society. They were both, managers, but they were also workers, and they occupied this strange place. They were really the only working, laboring group from Europe, as opposed to Asia, which made them different from the other ethnicities working the plantations. And so, I think that there was this sense that it was shameful to be Portuguese. And I think it takes a lot of effort to get over that and to reclaim it. I myself, I'm only an eighth Portuguese. The rest is Chinese and Filipino and a little bit of Spanish. But I'm very proud of that. And I think that among my generation, we're trying to recapture this as we learn. And it's not just learning what was written sort of in the history books, but diving a little bit deeper. I think now we're seeing a lot of people look back at history and in sort of a critical way and say, actually, it wasn't just what the main newspapers told. And this is exactly what Michael was illustrating, is that there was a whole set of other stories. And one thing that I'm really proud of is the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce of Honolulu. Half the board members are under 35. Although I guess some of them just turned 36, so half are under 36. So there's a bunch of young people who are doing events, and we're going to continue to do that. Food is a great way. Obviously, all the festas, lots of food brings people in. We have our wine tasting. But one goal that we want to have is just showcasing Portuguese culture to the public. And so prior to the pandemic, we were planning to have an exhibition on all of the important and influential Portuguese in Hawaii. because a lot of people, because they're mixed, don't know that so-and-so person is Portuguese. The founder of the biggest hula festival in Hawaii, the Merry Monarch Festival, she was Portuguese, but married to a Caucasian. And so everyone thinks that she's just Caucasian, she's English, but she was actually Portuguese. One of our champion surfers from the 60s and 70s, one of the founders of modern surfing, Fred Hemmings, is actually Fred Freitas Hemmings. And he's very proud to talk about being a Freitas. But of course, the public just hears Hemmings and they just think, his family is from the British Isles. So, I think it's making the Portuguese presence more known and kind of reclaiming that.
Indeed. And go ahead, Michael, please.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with Tyler more on all of those points. And the Portuguese occupied this incredibly liminal space where they were white at times when it was advantageous for those in positions of power for the Portuguese to be white, and at other times were not. And there was little incentive to claim a Portuguese identity, and in addition, so because of rights and privilege, what gets awarded with that exclamation. But the other thing too was that the Portuguese, and Tyler pointed this out perfectly too, is at one point we had the highest outmarriage rate. So even though we came as settlers, we soon this became home, and you married who you loved, and it wasn't necessarily true that you stayed within your racial or ethnic grouping. And so all of those things kind of conspire.
Indeed. I'm going to pose the question and the statement from Rui Faria, and we'll comment on that if we can just for a bit. And then I have one last question to ask both of you. If anybody else in the audience has any questions, please put them forth on the chat as well. So Rui asks if there are any statistics about the deaths aboard the ships from the Azores and Madeira to Hawaii. And he comments, I have read that there were even births aboard the different ships. Is that true? Indeed it is. Yeah, I've read the same thing. So Michael, anyone?
Yeah, there's a great article that I forgot. I think it was actually published in the 70s, but it was written aboard the Thomas Bell. It's a diary, and it records as many births as there were deaths. Yeah. And you'll see that or close to it. And you'll see that because in many instances, particularly early on, you're looking at a sail that took anywhere between 3 and 6 months. As the steamer ships came involved, it was much quicker. And so it wasn't unusual to have both birth and deaths. And you see that also because Portuguese had very large families in many cases, and also because they brought their grandparents. So the nature of things was such that you were going to have births and deaths aboard those ships, and oftentimes in equal measure.
And if there aren't any other questions, I do have one question, and it's kind of the $64,000 question, and it's because of the nature of our symposium. It's the Azores and the Azorean diaspora in the United States, and so and this is kind of hard for Tyler because he's in politics, but or maybe easier, which is and it's kind of course a little bit of a hypothetical. But if you were the president of the government of the Azores, if you were in charge of the government of the Azores, what two things, one or two or three, if you want to be very audacious about it, would you implement that would help the community in Hawaii? What would you implement? What would you think about that would be interesting to, and I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that, to implement a couple of ideas that would be helpful to connect the community in Hawaii to the Azores, for example, and we're talking more specifically the Azores, but this could be the same thing for mainland Portugal, could be the same thing, obviously, for the Madeira regional government as well. And before, as you think about that, because this idea that I think that we're all, coming upon, which is, and it was interesting when Michael read from the different newspapers, especially the Portuguese newspapers, at the time they considered themselves a colony. It was the same thing here. The colony of San Francisco, the colony of Sacramento, the colony of the San Joaquin Valley, the colony. And because Portugal, of course, had colonies all over at that time, and it was that concept of the colony. We transitioned away from that, and we transitioned to communities, and more we're using the word diaspora. because there's thought processes in this, and there are some people in Portugal, in the regional, both of the autonomous regions as well, that like, we're not basically immigrants, but we are. First of all, those of us who immigrated, yeah, that's what we are. And second of all, instead of communities or instead of diaspora, just Azoreans or Madeirans or Portuguese living abroad. We're not just simply for example, Tyler, who is 1/8, is not a Portuguese living abroad. And Michael, who's fourth generation, is not a Portuguese living abroad. I, who came from the Azores, I don't consider myself an Azorean living abroad. I consider myself an American now, with very deep ties to the Azores and Azorean first and foremost, because that's where I was born, and Portuguese citizen. But, we can't expect people to leave their country, even immigrants, and to be in another country 30 or 40 years and be the same as if they had never left. And so we also absorb everything that's going around us. And so a diaspora absorbs the country where you're living in or you're part of, but your ancestors came from. And it's important that from my perspective, and there's a movement on this, to really put forth all the effort into identifying ourselves as a living diaspora, someone who is creating in the American in the American society, whether we're in Hawaii or Massachusetts, and also that we have this connection between. One of the successes of diaspora is, of course, the connection in between the different communities. So I think it's important to have these connections between California and Hawaii and Oregon and all the other states where there are Portuguese Americans, in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, etc. So, but to go back to that, to give you a little bit of time, that's why I rambled on for a while. If you were the president or in charge of the Azores, and there's this movement in the Azores to have the communities aware and a better connection, what two things? And we'll start with Tyler, because he's the politician of all three of us. He is in charge. He is the chairperson, correct? The chairman of the Hawaiian Democratic Party.
Well, I think this question is both, I think, for the Azores and Madeira. And
right. Yeah. I'm glad you put that, because they both have regional autonomous governments now. Yeah, indeed.
And let me talk about Madeira first, which we'll get to the Azores. Hawaii is a sister state of the Azores, but not a sister state of Madeira. For whatever reason, in the 1970s, they created one relationship with one government and not with the other. And so a few years ago, there was a group trying to create a stronger bond between Hawaii and Madeira, since that didn't exist. And so they identified a couple of areas where more collaboration between those two governments could take place. And I think it's equally valid for the Azores. The first of which is sister cities. Each of the counties of Hawaii has a sister city relationship with somewhere in the Azores. I suspect that over the years, they haven't done anything to keep those relationships warm and cordial. I mean, all it takes, I think, is just sending a little package, saying hello with some, maybe some candy from Hawaii or chocolates or something. And just opening up those connections from a government to government perspective. Actually, Maui is trying to rekindle that. The director of the sister cities effort over there is herself, I think she's Azorean, Stephanie Kambra Ohigashi. So she's half Portuguese, half Japanese, very typical of Maui. And the mayor, of course, of Maui is also Portuguese, Mike Victorino. So there's definitely opportunities, I think, with the sister city movement. The second is with university relationships. The University of Hawaii is actually a pretty global university, but there really aren't that many connections with Portugal. And so whether it's universities in the Azores or in Madeira or on continental Portugal, building up those connections, possibly, having some sort of exchange program or sending, one or two students from Hawaii over there for a summer or a semester would help a lot. And then I think that there's also some opportunities for discussions on things like tourism, the Azores being islands in the Atlantic and Hawaii being islands in the Pacific. There's some great opportunities for connections on tourism, environmental protection, climate change. I know it's a huge topic given that they're islands. And then the last thing is here in the United States, there is a renaissance, I think, in people discovering their family history, thanks to, the DNA tests that you can do. And people are kind of rediscovering their family history. And through genealogical organizations, I think that there's opportunities for people to connect with their distant cousins over there. There's a cultural center being built in Hilo, and part of those plans include having a conference room with high-speed internet and cameras where families can sort of sit there and hopefully meet their long-lost cousins in Portugal. It would have to be, in the morning here in Hawaii, so it's the evening there, but I think they would have a good time reconnecting.
And maybe with translation services.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of good ideas.
Yeah, Tyler, slam dunk. And I see why you're in the positions you're in. But that's exactly it. And I was honestly thinking, not hard to understand why I'm in the position I'm in. I was thinking the university, we have incredibly intimate relationships throughout Asia. In fact, we have the East-West Center here on the island and adjacent to UH Manoa. I think if we made the same efforts in connecting with Portugal that we do with the others who have histories in the plantation society, that'd be a huge boon. And I don't think that we have that to a significant degree. And I think that that's something that we could do. I think on the Azorean and Madeiran side of the house too, I love that Tyler detailed the number of people in positions of power, or the number of notable people in the islands that have Portuguese heritage. And I think it'd be valuable for the Madeira and the Azores to lay claim, in the healthiest sense to that, saying these are our people. That I think my fear is that you described early on, and in the 1800s, this is likely so, that the Portuguese in Madeira and the Azores forgotten. And in fact, Rogers talks about, and Tyler talked about maybe an inferiority complex of the Portuguese in Hawaii. Rogers argues that the Portuguese in the Azores had no identity crisis, but maybe an inferiority complex, that because of the way that the abandonment in that experience. And rather than replicating that pattern, to shift that pattern and start creating connections between the Portuguese diaspora in the two places. So the Azores recognizing if Fred Hemmings is in fact Azorean in his background, to lay claim to that, or Madeiran, like my great-grandfather, Joaquim Freitas. So I think on the part of Portugal and the part of the two archipelagos, to reach out across, particularly California and Hawaii, and obviously the East Coast, but the East Coast feels like they've had access to some degree, but Hawaii has not. And so fermenting and solidifying those connections would be critical.
Indeed, yeah, and as both you and Tyler mentioned, there's of course, it's something that brings it together, being a group of islands. So I mean, you can and kind of a statehood. That's what the autonomy is. It's kind of a statehood within the country of Portugal. So there's a lot of things that can be done, including, as Tyler mentioned, establishing a statehood with Madeira, and also kind of revitalizing the sister statehood, because we have one, California's sister statehood. I don't know why exactly, but we are with the Azores, but there hasn't been anything done. So it's like, it's there on paper. It was done almost probably about the same time Hawaii was. I know that at the time, Dr. Mota Amaral, the very first president of the government of the Azores, was very keen in these protocols, these MOUs, and so it'd be good to revitalize them in this. And you're completely, I agree 100%, Tyler. The sister city movements are not being utilized as they should. They're powerful. They're people to people. They're local people to local people. I mean, it bypasses, a lot of government regulations, etc. So lots of good ideas. That all of these, by the way, are being compiled, and all of these I'm going to be sending to the Azores because that was my promise. So we'll be doing that. And I think that we should be talking about those. as much as we can. And an outreach. We, as Michael mentioned, when I met Michael, we have a course that we did. It was called the Azores People Traditions, and we had quite a few people from Hawaii, Michael and a few others. And I've told Fresno State on this course that we need to continue with this course, and it needs to be continued online because it offers people in other areas such as Hawaii and other states that don't have large Portuguese American populations the chance to learn about the islands. There's just a couple of comments, and one of them is from Audrey, who she says hello, and I thank you for the comment because I thought it was you, Audrey, but I didn't know for sure, and I didn't want to put my foot in my mouth. I do that quite often. So it was nice to see you also. It was in Piku many years ago. Not that many, but a few years ago. And yes, and thank you for the compliments to my students. And she mentions about, of course, for those of you who don't know, the Maui has the Portuguese Cultural Resource Center in the state. At this time on the Big Island, the Portuguese Chamber is in the process of building a Portuguese Cultural Center. And so lots of information there for those of you who are looking at. Please take a look at the comments from Audrey. And again, nice to see you. Pleasure's all mine. And Rui Faria is an Azorean from San Miguel Island. Thank you, rich conversation. So a big hug from islands to islands, indeed. And I think that he needs to be explored a little bit more. The island to islander, and Hawaii has that uniqueness. It's a real island. It's not like the islands we're trying to build here in California. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Tyler, for joining us so much in your insight as well. I think this has been grateful. Thanks to all the people putting forth nice comments. Those of you joining us, remember tomorrow we start at noon. We have a day dedicated to poetry, one event at 12, one at 1, and one at 3, all Pacific Daylight Time. Thank you all. Michael, it was a pleasure again. Tyler, nice seeing you. We'll see you hopefully one of these. Obrigado. Thank you all. Take care and have a wonderful weekend.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao. I like that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mahalo, Tyler. Thank you for being here. And
thank
you, Dinesh, as usual.
Thank you all. And thanks everyone for joining us. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.